Thank you all. Really looking forward to this conversation, actually. So Amanda and I, as she said, had a few discussions last night over drinks about the difficult questions we were going to pose you. And obviously I've got some questions that I think are really important to bring out a discussion around. But we will come out to you guys in the audience as well. So at different points in order to get questions from the room. The more difficult, the better. I think we should put them under pressure. They've got the spotlight on them. So, but I'd love to start with you, David, if that's okay, because obviously Amanda was talking before about strengths and how we work with different clients in terms of strengths. But I'd love to hear, and I'm sure everybody else would love to hear, how Flex have operated a strengths model when it comes to working with the individuals within the organisation.
Sure. Yeah. Morning, everyone. Actually, I just looked at it. I'm glad I'm not wearing the same jacket. Quite ironic. So I think we probably recognise that in some of the teams that we're part of working, that there's a degree of it's somewhat dysfunctional, and certainly when I joined Flex, it was, I think it's fair to say, a somewhat dysfunctional team, and that was impacting our performance without question. Right, I used to liken it to sort of like running with a stone in our shoe. We were just getting in the way of each other. We weren't effective as a group, and so we started to think about ways that we could address that. Clearly, we started to recognise the strengths in one another and what we were, each of us were bringing to that group, and that ultimately just meant that we were far more effective. But it changed the nature of the conversation. We looked at one another very differently. It built respect, it built understanding, and I think as that tends to lead to better conversations and better performance at the end of the day. So it built that degree of understanding that ultimately started to improve performance. We looked at people differently, talking about strengths rather than what they can do, what they bring to the team, not what they the negative aspects of how they impact the team. So that was a key benefit for us.
And have you seen many of the generational differences?
To some extent, yes. I think the points that you put up there, Amanda, we absolutely we recognise that. Actually, if you look at our leadership team, generationally, we're not too far apart from one another. It's a very new team, private equity. So we came in and we it's a very new team, but generationally not too diverse. Diverse in lots of other different ways, which I think is really quite interesting. Is the point that I think Amanda was talking about from Apple. There is a high degree of diversity in that team, and that might be something we want to talk about a little bit later. But we then used it around different teams within the organisation, and that generational differences became very apparent. Yeah, for sure.
I mean, Peter, do you see much in terms of generational differences within a law firm? Because obviously it's quite a different environment there.
Yeah, very significant generational differences. And actually, David and I were talking about this earlier. One of the challenges, so, as well as doing data and technology and stuff, one of my other roles is a new role as talent partner, looking at talent across the business. My bit of the business, which is corporate commercial. And one of the challenges we have is looking at career progression and aspirations within that part of the business. There are lots of very ambitious people, but who have very different views of what success is in their careers and in their future. And the conventional partnership model that law firms, professional services firms have been built on kind of works where everyone buys into a very conventional career path and career structure. And doesn't work so well where people want something quite different, and we're having to try and work out how, in what is a partnership model, you adjust to cater for those different expectations. And to be honest, it's difficult. We haven't got solutions at the moment.
Yeah. If we bring sport into this, so with you, Goldie, in terms of the way you see strengths playing out when it comes to needing to focus on a high performance, what are your observations there?
I mean, generally athletes are very, very driven by goals, and interestingly, or obviously, achiever was my highest strength. And just taking responsibility for performance. I think most athletes, especially Olympic athletes, are very, very motivated and brought alive by the Olympics. So when I look back at my career having retired, and I look back at what I did in order to become an Olympic medalist, I think it's absolutely bonkers now when I look at it. Training 6 hours a day, 49 weeks a year, but you're so energised by that goal of winning an Olympic medal that, that the hard work and the, blood, sweat and tears just isn't really a problem at all.
So how did you keep yourself motivated through the training programme, so between events, and being able to kind of keep yourself focused there?
I think, effectively it's generally about goal setting, and obviously the Olympics is a big driver, but each year you would have major championships, whether it was a World Championships, Europeans or Commonwealth Games, and just taking responsibility for that performance and being very, very self-motivated. That's never been a problem. I was talking to these guys earlier about I'd love to be able to switch that off sometimes, just that drive to achieve goals. If someone was to say to me, I bet you can't do that, that's the best thing you can possibly say to me.
Your motivator.
Yeah.
Amanda, when we were doing the research in terms of the winning attitude, what did you see there in terms of the connection between strengths and success when it gets to the highest levels within an organisation as well as within sport?
I think it's really interesting because mostly we found that the people who really achieved they had emotional intelligence as well. So they had some of the lower end strengths, so compassion, attention. So Goldie was a great example of that because one of your values came out as the genuine, didn't it? And it came out as looking after other people. And so when we did the winning attitude research, what we found is people who really succeeded actually had some of the strengths that actually aren't always present at top levels within organisations. And so actually it was the altruistic winning attitude characteristic that Goldie really demonstrated, which was you actually helped someone else beat you, didn't you? Do you remember when, yes, you actually coached someone to lower the tip of the javelin?
Yeah, well, I kind of enabled the world record holders to break the world record.
Yes, and you were like,
it was right
darn
it
it!
It was right at the end of the season, and I'd had my attempts, and it was just really annoying me that she was doing something. I mean, she had all the attributes that I didn't, and was about 6'2" and everything else. And I just said, look, just bring the tip down, and next throw she broke the world record. So,
yeah. And
take
so
a percentage, but I never got it.
And so, yes, I think that was what we saw, is the people who really won were demonstrating a different, almost unique combination of strengths, not necessarily the ones that you would expect to see. And the other thing that was really interesting about that research was that they all had a trigger. They'd all failed at some point, or they'd experienced something really difficult, really challenging in their lives that made them reassess and then identify a new goal.
So Goldie, what was your pivotal moment? Because I'm aware that you had one of those moments. So do you want to talk us through that?
I had several. I had eight operations in my career. Twice I was told I'd never throw again. I think the biggest, I don't know whether it's a failure or it was the biggest disappointment, was rupturing my elbow 3 weeks before the Olympics in London, when I'd just beaten the world record holder and won the final Diamond League meeting. So that was, I still don't know quite why that happened, but certainly failure in sport, I see, having retired, it's a dirty word in most businesses. And as a sports person, you're like, why on earth wouldn't you try and almost strive to fail? I mean, on a daily basis, you'd be pushing yourself in the gym and, put more weight on the bar and to see if you could do it, but inevitably you'd end on a failure, and that was good because the next time then you achieve it and you keep doing it. And I think just sharing failures and discussing why things went wrong and what could be done better and what needs to change was a massive part of my career. But then obviously coaching is huge in sport, and but yeah, I mean, you'd often fail and have. I mean, I can categorically say I've failed a million times more than I succeeded, but I can still sit here as a 3-time Olympian, so I think failure is a good thing.
I think we talk a lot about organisation safety at the moment. I think it's probably a buzz phrase for organisations, and it's probably one of the reasons that maybe there is a safer environment to fail within sport than maybe within organisations. David, do you experience that in terms of people's attitude towards failure within the organisation or within other organisations?
Definitely. And that might be part of there's a generational dimension to that. You know, I think as part of the research perhaps brought out, you know, the younger generation are more willing to take risks. You know, they've learned that failure is a good thing. I think, you know, whereas perhaps an older generation, which I'm probably part of, failure was seen as failure. But I think there's also, to some extent, a functional diversity. You know, I don't know if there's any accountants in the room, but you know, or perhaps lawyers, for example. You know, I know, you know, my CFO and CFOs that I've worked with consistently. Part of their job is to keep us in business. So their view of risk, their view of failure, is somewhat different to, say, some of my colleagues. You know, our chief commercial officer, for example, who's all about trying new things and you know, different pricing models and, you know, how we can do things very differently. You know, and again, you know, those conversations are real conversations within our exec team, and you know, they can lead to a high degree of tension. And you know, coming back to the strengths point, is that you get through those because you recognise that that they're coming at it from different perspectives, but they're trying to get to the same goal and recognising the strengths in one another. You know, Susan, our CFO, is trying to keep us in business. John, our CEO, who's an American, who's kind of a bit, you know, kind of out there, he's trying to grow our business. You know, so they've got different perspectives on risk and failure as a result.
I mean, how easy is it to fail within a law firm?
Well, I was about to say that. It's a really challenging one because we're sort of not allowed to get advice wrong. We're not allowed to get the law wrong. And reputationally, that sort of failure is, people tend to come into the business and are terrified of it. And so all the junior lawyers start out thinking, I've got to tell people what the law is, and I've got to, you know, the worst possible thing would be my client does something that they're not supposed to do. And the trouble is that you then have the risk, well, and because of the partnership model, people go through and you end up at the top having started out as a junior lawyer. The risk is that you have an entire organisation full of risk-averse people who don't understand, you know, how to take business risk decisions very well. But obviously, actually, so that's a challenge we've got. And partly you might say, well, that's why you need more diversity in law firms and senior management, not just lawyers. But anyway, that's another point. But I think you partly learn about that sort of the risk advice point, because as you get more senior, you're working with clients and you're understanding that it's not just about what does the law say, it's what's the right commercial outcome for the clients. And so doing what your CFO probably does, the kind of balancing act that, so as you get more senior, you get more used to doing that. And so when you're in a management role, you've got more experience of doing that working with clients. So I suppose you learn some of that. I think failure, so failing in giving legal advice, not much tolerance to junior level, people are terrified of it. Failure in a pitch or other contexts, I think that those are things that we're constantly building on client relationships and trying to win work and keep clients. So actually there's more of you put yourself up to fail fairly regularly, and so you do learn that, and I think there's more tolerance of that. And certainly I'd say at the firm I work for, that there is people are encouraged to try, and if that means you go for something, you aim high and you don't quite get there, that's tolerated.
I mean, David, are there any cultural aspects that you would consider really important in order to give people the confidence that they can fail?
I think cultural. I'm not sure. There are certain cultural aspects. I think, our experiences of having failed probably, in our past sort of lead us to, how tolerant we are. I think one of the points about failure that I find quite interesting, which to some extent is cultural, and maybe it's, I think, this point about diversity, I recognise diversity in from lots of different dimensions, whether that's, I've lived and worked in different cultures, Asia, the US, and different functional diversity. But I think, it's coming back to this point, I work in a very regulated environment, yet, by the nature of what we do, drug trials, we have to fail in order to move things forward. We do things, we get results. Quite often those results give us different outcomes that they lead to failure. But the regulation around our industry doesn't necessarily encourage that whole approach. And I'm not talking about failure in terms of administering drugs to people that can cause serious harm. I'm talking about there's a mentality, a cultural mentality around procedural failure. We get audited, countless times, and it's around procedural failure rather than, so there's a cultural thing around regulation in a highly regulated industry. It's one thing that I've kind of found quite interesting, because I'm not a pharmaceutical person. Life sciences is a relatively new industry for me. I come from telecommunications and technology. So I think, we've got this sort of dichotomy that we're in, to do what we do and what our clients do, we've got to fail. We've got to try things. We've got to do things differently. Coming in a private equity business where there's a lot of pressure for us to grow and change and evolve, we've got to do things differently in how we run and manage our business. Yet we're in a very regulated environment which doesn't typically tolerate that or encourage that.
Thank you. So, Goldie, when have you felt at your strongest?
I think we're in sport, certainly when mentally and physically you're at one and striving towards a goal that you're very motivated by.
So do you think the business can learn anything from that approach?
I think certainly, with the advent of email and so much, the people are required to do so much stuff, whether that's actually effective stuff, I'm not sure sometimes. So for me now, in business, I'll just make sure when I'm at my best, which is generally in the morning, I do the stuff that is most applicable to me achieving my target of whatever that is that week, month, year.
So we've got you the right time of day.
Yeah, ish.
Bit early.
And Amanda, because obviously we've looked into resilience and how people can be at their best and be at their strongest. Because to a certain extent, some of what we've been talking about is where people are feeling pressure and where they're finding things very difficult. But do you have any insight in terms of how people can really think about being at their strongest?
I think for me, the first thing is, of course, to take the time to identify what energises you, to find out what do you enjoy. That's the very first thing. And the second thing, to be prepared to actually reflect. I'm surprised at how many people can actually kind of verbatim talk about, for example, the insights colours or the MBTI, but they don't necessarily really think about, so what does that mean? They've got almost like a dialogue that they might start to describe themselves using various tools, even our strengths tool, but they don't necessarily take a step back and say, so what does that mean in terms of the way I interact and the way I engage? And sometimes it can be a little bit uncomfortable to think about some of the resilience elements, for example, how am I feeling emotionally? And so that's one of the things I'm really interested in, because I think we can articulate sometimes certain characteristics, our personality, but we don't necessarily really delve within ourselves to really focus on how are we feeling in a given day, how is it impacting me, and then how far is it going to then impact my performance and my capability.
Thank you. I think if we're going to talk a little bit, because one of the things you were just talking about there was regulation and the challenges that brings to people internally. And I'm observing that people are finding GDPR a big administration exercise, as well as a lack of awareness for actually what the true legislation means for the organisation and also for talent programmes. I mean, Peter, can you talk to us a little bit in terms of your observations around GDPR, how it's settling in and how organisations are really beginning to manage that?
Yeah, so one of the ways that I've worked with the guys here on BeTalent and from a GDPR point of view has been looking at the both pre-GDPR and post-GDPR, how do we manage compliance? And I think it's fair to say that immediately pre-GDPR there was panic, not here.
We had you.
Yes.
We had lots of people off the street, as it were, coming to us. So we had very, very well established clients that had pre-GDPR readiness programs that we were supporting them on, and those were kind of quite rewarding to work on. And then we had quite a lot of people sort of panic buying off the street saying, can you just help me with a privacy policy, which was thoroughly unrewarding, and we ended up turning people away and saying, look, we can't give you the advice you're looking for. There is, if you just want an off-the-shelf privacy policy, go and find one somewhere else. But what we are bringing is professional advice on what's right for your business and how does it work. And I think in a talent management context and in an HR context, there were some particularly acute issues that people were kind of grappling with around who's a data controller, who's a data processor, what can we do with profiling, what privacy notices do we need to be giving people, what do we do in terms of sharing data across the group and globally, which is coming back again with Brexit at the moment. So I think there were some, what we saw at the time was people doing, shall we say, some of the easy wins that they just needed to get in place to get over the line so that they felt reassured that if the ICO turned up the next day, they'd done those kind of basic things. So we've got a data protection policy, we've got a privacy notice for employees. I think what we're seeing now is now the dust settled a bit and people have kind of got comfortable with the fact that the ICO hasn't got the resources to be going around checking up on every tiny little bit of compliance, and frankly nobody's fully compliant. People are actually starting to take the time to look at the things that really matter in the organisation about where GDPR applies, and perhaps taking, shall we say, more intelligent, informed decisions about what they can and can't do. I think, again, initially there was we can't do anything with data, and so, an example I always give, because it's very sad to me, was there were various charities that have got in touch over the last 12 months who said, yes, we wrote to all of our donors and said, unless you opt in next week, we'll never write to you again. And now we don't have any donors. And you sort of want to say to, you end up having to give them some risk-based advice around how you continue to operate as a charity in that context, where they didn't have the resources to make a sensible assessment in the first place. They're now having to make a risk-based judgment on what the right thing is to do. And I think that the same applies in a talent and HR context, where people almost stepped back and said, well, we can't use these tools that actually are really valuable to help identify talent in a business and manage that talent because we're worried about GDPR. GDPR says no. And I think now people are perhaps a bit more sophisticated.
Yeah, I think we're still seeing quite a lot of nervousness, certainly when we're dealing with the Works Council on the continent. There's incredibly stringent requirements coming out from those organisations. But what would be your advice in terms of if you were in an HR team working with a consultancy, what would be your advice to the HR team that they should be demanding of that consultancy or making sure that those kind of practices were in place?
So I think, it depends what the consultancy are doing. So the first thing is that, as we've talked about before, there are consultancies can take on different roles. So they can take on a coaching role or a role where they have the relationship directly with the individual, where in data protection terms they're clearly a data controller, and so they will have their own privacy policies, their own compliance programs. And so as an HR team I would be saying, look, I'm entrusting my employees to your care effectively, much like a benefits provider or something. Please demonstrate to me as part of due diligence that you are going to look after them properly. It's your compliance responsibility because you're going to be managing the uses of the data and so on, but I want the reassurance from a due diligence point of view that you're doing the right things. You've got your privacy policy, you've got a data protection approach to data protection, and you can demonstrate the technical security in terms of your uses of data, how you're sharing data and encryption and so on. So I think there's that sort of due diligence point where you're handing over the relationship. And then I think there's the other side, which is also consultancies will take on another role, which is much more working as an extension of an HR team and doing an assessment across a whole load of different people in the business and providing a report to the HR team, where it's much more about what's the terms of engagement for bringing on board the consultancy as a processor potentially, depending on what they're doing in that context. So yeah, there are a few questions to ask.
So in terms of Brexit, Deborah mentioned it earlier, so I don't feel like it's not to be mentioned. So obviously, I feel that actually there's a lot of unknown in terms of what will happen when we leave the European Union. What's the advice that you're giving UK organisations in terms of the EU and Brexit when it comes to GDPR?
So broadly, we're expecting things to stay pretty similar in this country, and that the government and the ICO have made clear that that's the expectation, so no wholesale change. people are having to look at data flows between European countries and the UK, potentially looking at standard clauses and other solutions for transferring data around the group, either to put in place the second after Brexit happens or in advance. I think that the big nervousness has tended to be around no deal Brexit and getting data from the EU to the UK, where there are some solutions within a group that you can put in place in terms of sort of model clauses and so on. But in terms of, for example, appointing external processors, there are some challenges, shall we say. So I'd say we get fairly regular questions about it, but there are only certain things you can do, and so you do those things, and beyond that, I mean, from a risk judgment point of view, it's highly unlikely that there will be any enforcement promptly after a Brexit in this country or in the EU relating to data flows that have to happen within an organisation that's acted responsibly in terms of trying to consider how they're compliant. So there's only so much you can do.
I mean, has David, in your organisation, I'm not going to ask you about GDPR, don't worry. But I think in terms of your organisation and the kind of like the preparations that people are making from their own, kind of managing the talent information that you hold, because obviously you are a global organisation as well. Are there any some kind of things that you are thinking about that maybe are helping prepare everybody and put everyone's...
As regards Brexit, particularly?
Yes.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, I mean, we've developed an operational capability in the EU as well as in the EU. So we've got, we're kind of hedging in that regard. So that wasn't the driver necessarily. Brexit wasn't necessarily the driver. So, we can deliver and we can store data and process data in different jurisdictions, which kind of gives us that sort of flexibility. So that's one thing. And I think as well, in terms of our human capital data, is we're working with, we're transitioning. So we're working with partners that, I think to your point, Peter, about making sure that our diligence on our suppliers, the people that hold our employee data, that they are compliant in terms of where that data is held, where their server farms are, and various other things. And we do that obviously with our data that we hold around the trials that we process as well. So, there's a tech aspect to this where data is being held and such like, which we've, hedged or made sure that we're through our due diligence with our vendors, we've selected, and then we've hedged our operations in that regard as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important where people are involved with talent programs that they can trust the organisations to look after their information. So
it's interesting. I don't know if anybody else. We haven't been asked. I haven't had anybody. Maybe we should have been a little more proactive. That's an interesting thought. But I haven't had anybody come to our team, an EU citizen, and say, what's going to happen to me? Some of our employees. So I don't know. Maybe we should have gone out and reassured them. But I haven't had anybody come to us and say, look, I'm a little nervous about my status and how my employment be affected and such like.
Well, that's interesting, because I think that I do hear people within development programs having those conversations, but I don't think they are having those conversations with the organisations. And we had a situation recently which is slightly different in terms of someone logging into our site and seeing a link to our Facebook page and assuming that we were going to share their data with Facebook. And so therefore we had a complaint raised, and we had to strengthen our privacy policy and also we removed that link just to be 100% clear. So I think that there's because there's so much ambiguity, so going back to Amanda's VUCA principle, that actually people don't know what they don't know, and they're kind of, because this has dragged on a little bit, maybe not asking some of the questions that they could ask, maybe. Does because I can come out to the room now in terms of any questions. Does anybody have any questions for the panel? I'll step down. I'd like to ask either on strengths and resilience or also around the GDPR question. I'll come to the back there.
We've got another microphone, haven't we, Deborah?
Thank you. I have a question. I have a couple actually, but we haven't got that long, so I'll stick with one of them. And that's on the strengths side of it. So my role is I go into organisations and it's on the talent and resourcing, and I set up talent processes, tools, etc. And one of the things that I found since I left Shell 12 years ago is many organisations is that, didn't even have a set of comprehensive behaviours or they were too comprehensive and the line had no idea how to use them, they got confused. And, for me, the whole point is to create something that is simple and easy to use and that provides a fair assessment, whether it's at selection or whether it's at performance or whether it's at development. So where I guess I'm struggling a bit is on the strengths. So my understanding of strengths versus behaviours is strengths is about, what you on a good day, what are your strengths, and if we use Hogan as you referred to, which I'm accredited to like Hogan, is and also what's you on a bad day, basically. So how on earth do you then use that in the kind of assessment tools that you need to recruit? Because I've had examples in organisations where people have recruited based on the person's strengths and then it's caused chaos in the organisation. Because, if you said, what, I think you're really great, you've got these strengths and I'm going to put you in this role, but you don't think someone has, then it becomes chaotic. So I'm guessing what I'm struggling with is how you use strengths and embed that comprehensively, or not comprehensively, in a more simple, pragmatic way in an organisation versus the old-fashioned behaviours and proficiency levels.
Thank you. That was a marvellous question, which I think I can answer. So it's going back to that point about strengths being the icing on the cake. They're not. You shouldn't necessarily just use strengths. In the same way as you shouldn't ever just use a psychometric without any feedback or validation, I don't think you should ever use strengths without using other concepts too. Actually, our model of potential, it's called the BEST model. So it's behaviours and expertise, which are the old-fashioned competencies and capabilities. So for me, that's can you do the job? So you still have to assess whether the person can do the job. The next question is, do they fit culturally into the organisation? And that's the T in BEST, and that's tenets. So it's about the principles that they live by and work by. Are they the same as the organisations? And then the strengths are the final question, which is what do they bring, what energises them? And so for me, you still have to do the fundamentals, the steady, consistent part of the behaviours, the expertise and the values or tenets. The uniqueness, what the individual brings, are the strengths. And I had a great example with a client in a card services organisation, which showed the difference between someone who did and didn't culturally fit. So she works for card services. She's the global talent director, and she articulated her values being bold, aspirational, entrepreneurial and visionary. And then I asked her to talk about the values of the organisation. And on the website, the values on the website were very similar. So bold, visionary, aspirational. And then I asked her what it's really like to work in that card services organisation. She said structured, vigilant, compliant, disciplined. And she had that moment of, oh, crap. Oh, I don't fit. Because every day is a battle, because she wants to disrupt, but the organisation isn't prepared to be disrupted. So your point about somebody bringing somebody in who doesn't quite have the fit. So for me, values, strengths are very different. Values is about fit and strengths are about what makes you great. So that's how I use it.
Thank you. So we've got time for just one more question, if anybody has a question.
Hey, good morning.
Hi.
My name's Adam. Nice to meet you, Amanda, finally.
Hi.
I come from a product and service innovation background, and I love the idea of a platform to enable these kind of mechanics to come to people's to hands so they can become better. But do you have any worries about kind of productizing these aspects, and any worries about distancing the kind of one-to-one connection between the human layer for the people that have expertise to guide people and coach people, to people taking these aspects in their own hands and not really understanding how or what it is and how they can best use it without the appropriate guidance from team members and support?
It's a great question, actually, because one you and I actually had a chat about before, didn't we? Because we were talking about what we're trying to do is actually bring the psychology of talent into the hands of the user. So by developing the 10 product suites that we've created, of which the Strengths Suite is one of them, and by creating different methods of assessment, so cards, questionnaire, 360, what we're doing is trying to have different ways that the individual can interact with the concept of strengths, for example. So you can complete the card sort exercise yourself, and you don't need necessarily to have a feedback interview, because it's about you experiencing and playing with the cards and saying, okay, these are my aspired strengths. These are the things I think I've got. And so it becomes a little bit more, in fact, it was your word that you said to me the other day when we spoke on the phone, more intimate, because actually this is mine. I don't actually have to go and talk to anyone about it. And I can actually start thinking about what does this mean for me. Whereas with the questionnaire, the results are inferred. And you do then need to sit down with a psychologist, and the psychologist helps you, or the coach helps you understand and interpret what does that really mean. And you can have that fantastic, rich conversation about the real meaning behind the questionnaire. So for me, I don't think it takes away the intimacy. Actually, I think technology is enabling us to actually bring psychology closer and bring the concepts of talent closer to the individual, making it more usable, hopefully, and hopefully fun. We'll see. We have actually got time for a couple more questions if you'd like them.
We've got 1 minute. So.
Have we?
Yes.
1 minute. Quick question.
Is there one more question? Oh, down the back. Thank you. Such a disruptor.
I am such a disruptor.
Morning. I'm a operations person, so I'm a chief commercial officer, but my research area is mental toughness. And when we researched mental toughness, one of the things that we identified was that it's contextual. So the characteristics and the strengths and the attributes of mentally tough sports people as well as business professionals is contextual. So certain things are strengths in certain environments, but there are also weaknesses in other environments. And I just wondered whether you come across that in your research.
Yeah, I can talk, and then maybe Goldie can talk as well, if that's all right. But yes, completely. And that's why I love strengths, because that unique combination is so different for different people. So even though I've given the summary of these are the top 7 strengths in the execs and the lowest 7 for the 2,000 people, what I find is that actually it's that unique combination that really, really helps to describe. I have brilliant aha moments when I open Strengths Insight reports on the second coaching session, because the first one we've defined the objectives, and then we look at the strengths report in the second one. I'm like, okay, I get it. I understand why. And I see completely different combinations in different sectors as well, which I find fascinating. I don't know if you've got anything to comment, Goldie, in terms of the differences in strengths you've seen with different types of sports people.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, even in sport. I think people tend to lump sports people as one category of person. When I trained with people who would be in tears on the start line, who were fantastic trainers, awful competitors, and vice versa. I mean, the sweet spot is those that come alive under pressure. You know, at the Olympic Games, I'm sure Greg Rutherford wouldn't mind me saying, he wasn't a terrible trainer, but he was injured a lot of the time. But he was brilliant at competing and you know, adding 10% in competition. So I think it is contextual in terms of, you know, what is energizing you. So I think there are those athletes that come alive at the Olympic Games because, I mean, for me, it was something that was greater than just winning. It was for other people, and I think that's what motivated me. There were those that completely imploded because they found the pressure too much. And, you know, my coach used to talk about 5-ring fever because people put this emphasis on this one day every 4 years that, you know, it's really hard. But, you know, they forget that it's the same people, they're competing against the same track, same conditions. So, yeah, mental toughness is an interesting one, I think. But resilience for me is the biggest thing, because you will always become under pressure and there will always be problems in any industry. And I think the people who overcome setbacks are those that see them as the obstacles as opportunities. So I think the only reason I came back from so many surgeries is because I love learning and I saw it as a major challenge. And again, if I'm told that I can't do something, I'll find every which way to do it, or at least find the people who know the answers, because I think most things are, you know, you can overcome with the right people and the right attitude, and I think positivity is one of my strengths. So yeah, it's a fascinating area, but if you're putting someone in an area or industry that they hate, they're never going to be mentally tough because it doesn't mean enough to them.
if I can just, if I may, just for 30 seconds, I think that context is really important. Understanding context. I'm sure we've all been in businesses that, businesses, depending on where they're at in their life cycles, if they're, you're trying to downsize a business, or you're trying to grow a business, or you're trying to scale a business, whatever it is that's going on, understanding that context and where, therefore, pressure is likely to be applied, whether it's in an operational environment or a sales environment or a finance environment, understanding that is really crucial, where that pressure is going to be, where it's going to manifest itself most, understanding that context, and therefore having the tools where we can understand behaviours and psychology and various other things and apply that in the appropriate area. I think combining that business context with some of these tools is really, really important, because context, I think, is really crucial.